A woman tells her longtime therapist, "I'm feeling sad." And psychiatrist says, "That's called depression. Come see me next week." The next week she says, "It's the strangest thing. As soon as I left your office, I started feeling happy." The psychiatrist says, "That's called mania. Come see me next week." And the next week she says, "It's the strangest thing. I actually feel much calmer now that I know I'm a manic depressive. I guess it just took me a while to recognize it." And the psychiatrist says, "That's called a learning disability. Come see me next week." And the next week she says, "It's the strangest thing. I actually feel a little bit smart. Now that I know that I have a learning disability, I've learned something." And the psychiatrist says, "That's called borderline personality disorder. Come see me next week." Next week she says, "I feel like whatever I say, you tell me to come see you next week." And the psychiatrist says, "That's called paranoia. Come see me next week." But the woman has an idea. The next week she sits down and says nothing. The psychiatrist asks her how she's doing, but still, she doesn't respond. He smiles and says, "That's called schizophrenia. Come see me next week." At this point, the woman is completely fed up. She goes back next week, waits for the psychiatrist to ask her again how she's doing, and then explodes. "I feel great. I feel amazing. I feel fantastic. I have only one problem. Do you know what that problem is? You." And the psychiatrist smiles and says, "That's called sociopathy. Come see me next week." And that settles it. She knows this man's a charlatan. So next week, she invites a reporter to accompany her. The psychiatrist is surprised and asks for a private word with the reporter. And moments later, the reporter returns and takes the woman aside. "Sorry, ma'am, you have a mental illness, and the psychiatrist wants us to protect your reputation." This won't do. So next week, she calls a police officer. But once again, the psychiatrist requests a word, and the police officer returns and says, "Sorry, ma'am, you have a mental illness, and the psychiatrist tells us your testimony can't be trusted." Now, this certainly won't do. So next week, she calls a lawyer. But once again, the psychiatrist requests a word, and the lawyer returns and says, "Sorry, ma'am, you have a mental illness, and the psychiatrist tells us you don't have the right to hire an attorney." Outraged, the woman doesn't wait till next week, and this time she contacts a politician. She tells the politician the whole story, and he is as outraged as she is. And together they march into the psychiatrist's office, at which point the psychiatrist pulls out a gun and shoots the politician. The woman is horrified, but the psychiatrist smiles. "What are you going to do? You've been held in this hospital for 9 years. The nurses here have already seen me kill multiple times and will cover for me. If they complain, I'll tell them they're wrong, and their entire livelihoods depend on the belief that my word is infallible. Because if it's not, they've been engaging in criminal behaviour for the past several years. And even if someone has a change of heart, what's the worst that could happen to me? My professional colleagues will tell the court I'm mentally ill. I'll come right back here, and my colleagues will release me. I'll barely leave this office. And as for you, tomorrow I will electroshock you until you forget this. Increase your medication until you can't speak, and even if you could remember, seclude you so you couldn't tell anyone, even if you could speak. And all of this just in the interim while I decide the most expensive way to kill you. You'll barely be conscious, let alone be able to escape. But even if you did, every psychiatrist, every nurse, and every social worker in the country already knows my scheme, and you'll be hunted down and returned to me, and anyone else who sees you won't believe a word of it because of how you look. Now, apologise for not forgiving me and get out of my office." And the woman makes her best attempt at apologising for not forgiving and goes back to her room and hangs herself. The next week, the psychiatrist is having coffee with a colleague, and the colleague asks, "What happened to that depressed woman you've been telling me about?" The psychiatrist shakes his head. "Suicide." The friend, "That's too bad. What about that new therapy?" "Which one?" "The one where you were raping her after each session." "Shows promise."